All right. Let's jumping on here one more time to see if I can keep this thing going. Last time we were on, we talked about making Wednesday the day that I would do this every single week, and I think I'm gonna make that happen. So I'm actually kind of excited about this. So today's episode, right? Welcome to Live Ink. Right, we're on here for another round of this. I'm gonna be inking what I got going on here today. Kind of see what I can do with it. Yeah, I just gonna talk about some topics like I talked about I would do next time. So I don't have as much of a script this time as I did last time. So this might actually be a little bit more all over the place, but that's kind of okay. It's kind of the way I decided to do it in this format and turn it into kind of a live show. I wonder if you can you see that from there? Yeah, there you go. Well, you can hit here as I kind of choose my weapon. I think I'm just gonna, right now I'm just kind of doing my first initial layer of the inks. When I do that, I'm always just kind of like hitting it with a thin line, kind of adding my details as I go and going from there. All right, let's see. I'm gonna do something real quick here over here. I should have taken 2 seconds before I did this, huh? All right, cool. I've got everything set up the way I need to now. Just let music going in the background. All right, jump back in and do this thing. So yeah, this is called Live Ink. This is an episode or a new show that I kind of just decided to start where I could basically use the live platform and what I know about art and the daily struggles of art to talk about those daily struggles. And the thing that has been on my mind this week is using reference. So I've had a lot of talks lately and kind of overheard artists and other people talking about this and almost like not fully understanding where they're coming from. And I know everyone can definitely have their own sort of opinion on this thing, but there's definitely a weird misconception that I hear from a lot of artists that using reference is in some way cheating. It's like it's not your own art because you found a picture somewhere else on the internet and used it to kind of as your inspiration. And I think that's kind of the key word. And I think maybe that's where people get the most tripped up is that it's about using that thing for your inspiration. You're not literally just copying and redrawing another artist's thing. The idea is like this is a really good example right here. I'm drawing this cool sort of Mario fan art piece. I don't know what Bowser looks like, what Mario looks like, what any of these things actually look like, just like off the top of my head, right? I have to look at things. I have to kind of reference kind of different angles of a thing to kind of get what I need to do. So like even like for Bullet Bill here, right? Like I kind of knew it was like a cylindrical form with a little bit of a sort of like taper at some point, and then there's like a face that goes on top of that thing, right? So when we talk about like using reference and how I kind of got to where I got here, I looked up the picture of it from Mario. I looked up some other pictures of other things that kind of have similar shape, and I looked up other references of things that I might reference when I draw eyes or noses or mouths or things like that. And that's how I was able to kind of make it mine, right? So there's this weird thing that I always hear of like, well, like if I look at another artist's work of art as I get started or anything like that, then I've somehow tainted or damaged the thing that I was trying to do. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from today with this episode. What's up, Ace? Thanks, man. I should put that on a sign or something. That's a really good quote. All right, so let's start with what I was kind of thinking. So I wrote down a couple of different things I knew I wanted to talk about, and that was kind of the main talk there. But the difference between copying, right, and using a reference. So, and actually, even in a future video, I will probably actually touch on this topic because honestly, there is something to the idea of literally like an artist you love, something you struggle to draw, you're bad at anatomy or things like that. There is actually something to just like straight up printing off something and tracing your lines over that thing and just kind of practice that form when you're bad at that thing. And that's a whole other topic, but that right there is not your own work of art, right? That's a study. That's like something you use to kind of get yourself going, right? So that's copying, but we're talking about using an actual reference here. We're talking about the idea that if I want to draw an eye, if I have not drawn thousands of eyes in my lifetime, and even a lot of artists who do art all the time haven't, you're not just gonna be able to pull that out of your brain just randomly and try to get that looking line for line what it's supposed to look like. We forget details. We make assumptions of what things look like, and that's like super bad for our like if we assume that the eye goes in certain spots or that the round part of the eye takes up a certain amount of space, we end up with really weird proportions and sort of bad, to use the term, kind of art, right? So what's really important is that using references, but using multiple references. That's like number one right there, right? Like you gotta like, I'm not just pulling the first image I see on Google Images of this thing. I'm pulling a bunch of different angles. I'm pulling a bunch of different ways it's done. One big thing that I always talk about too is multiple, like some from real life and some from drawn and some from the media or inspiration. So kind of as Comic Den is saying, like adding your own flavor, the place that the flavor comes from is that like you're going to reference something from real life. So let's say you're going to draw this bullet bill here that I'm inking right now, right? Look up an actual bullet. You want to put your own spin on bullet bill, and you want to go real far off in your own style and direction. Look at different kinds of bullets. Like he was obviously inspired by a specific type of bullet, right? Look up long barrel rifle bullets and small, tiny little like pistol bullet things like that, right? And you'll get a different form, and then you can take that as a blank canvas and place things on it. So I always recommend a minimum of 3 references whenever you're like getting yourself started with a new idea. Like 2 maybe if you're really pushing it, but like never just be drawing from one reference, because then you might get really close to that sort of copying aspect. And I think maybe that's where this misconception or where this like fear comes from, that if I've got things and I'm looking at those things to draw from, that I am going to just end up copying that thing. But I mean, if you got to think about like film, movies, and stuff like that, right? There are obvious imitations of movies. Like there's transmorphers for Transformers, right? There are horrible, literal, straight rip-off movies, and then there are good movies that come from inspirations. Like just the idea of just general giant robots, right? If we were to fear that every time we made a new movie about giant robots, we'd be ripping off Transformers or whatever movie or show first told you that giant robots were cool, like we never get anything new. We would be just afraid of constantly ripping off and taking things from other people. And so I think it's the main reason why I have this talk too, is because it's how you get better at art, is by referencing different things at different moments and times during your career as an artist, and pulling from inspirations maybe that you don't always pull from, right? Like when you're flipping through on Instagram and you see awesome art and stuff, like screenshot that thing, right? Like nab that and don't let that thing go away, because you're going to eventually come back to like, oh, this one time I saw this really cool image of this guy's face and it was in this thing or whatever, and then if you didn't screenshot it, it's gone. Like you have just the fleeting sort of image of how you were inspired by that thing the first time you saw that thing, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. And then you go to draw that thing and it looks kind of off or odd, or you can't really exactly pull that inspiration or that influence if you're not constantly snagging and taking those things and putting them places, right? So I actually recommend folders. Like literally on my phone in my gallery, I have named folders for like everything. Like when I see line work that I love, I will screenshot it. When I see robots, because that's my thing, right? Like my analog missions is all just a bunch of really fun robots and stuff like that. So when I screenshot that, if I have like a whole folder of cool things to look at, to inspire masks for different robots, for faces, for body types, all kinds of stuff like that, right? I have a whole folder of reference too, of different body shapes and times that I've seen different artists kind of play with that kind of thing. So like the only way you're ever going to get better at your art and keep doing that is by literally consistently looking at reference when you're drawing, when you're sketching, when you're doodling, like even in your like studies in your sketchbook. I honestly, especially in your sketchbook studies, I feel like you have like stuff in your sketchbook, like people don't see my sketchbook. I don't post it because a lot of times what's happening in my sketchbook is a lot of just straight up like work copying and studies of anatomy and stuff like that. Like that stuff's not art in terms of works of art. That's like my studying process of art and what gets me like prepared for when it's time for the big game kind of thing, right? That's the practice mode. I'm not gonna try and sell stuff from my sketchbook like it's some original thing that only I've ever done kind of stuff. And that's I think that's where people get the most tripped up on this kind of topic is that thing. And they're like, oh, well, I want to be able to, like, all my art should be able to be sold and shown and all this kind of stuff. And I think there's phases to sort of making and creating your art where you are sometimes in a place where the things you're drawing are just for the sake of practicing new lines and new language and new shapes and things that you don't always draw, right? Like even like the way I draw my smoke, like this right here is a really cool shape that I love, and I was inspired by some other artists, like a couple of different artists actually, who like kind of do this really cool skinny, jaggedy, smooth line form stuff like that. And then after I looked at that and I drew that and I kind of found a way to make it my own. Now it's something that I can very easily pull to and draw without reference, but I only have this in my whatever you want to call that, maybe your belt of imagination, your bank whenever it's time to draw something new because the first time I saw that I referenced from that thing, right? So save everything, make it your own, reference all the time, right? I don't I know I kind of this one was a little bit more on the fly because I wanted to after I started the show last week, I was like, I want to make sure I keep doing this. I want to make sure that I keep kind of talking about topics that I really feel passionate about and care about. And I just want to like end this kind of thing here. And probably going to doodle for a little bit longer because I'm definitely kind of just I'm in a zone here where I'm going to be just inking kind of for a while. So I will be talking about a couple other different things here while I'm on too. I kind of have a little list here, different things that have been on my mind. But everything you draw, or you make, or you write, or you create is in some way, shape, or form from something you've experienced through your senses, right? And for drawing, it usually is a visual thing. It's something you've seen, and your mind has kind of taken that thing and reimagined that and found ways to change it and make it your own. So, like, even the act of watching new movies outside of your comfort zone and reading books and looking at art in different medias than you're usually used to, it's going to inspire like stuff for you to be able to create from. I think that's a huge thing too. So about a year ago, I kind of came to this realization that I do this thing too much, and that's when I reference. I always try to look up ink drawings and references from literally like artists that I know, which is good. And it led me definitely to a style and a thing that I see. But at the same time, like if I do that too much, I'm putting myself in that box of only ever like having my stuff look like it came from that place. And so I realized that I have to start referencing more from like real life, more from uh, pencil drawings, more from paintings, more from stuff that is kind of outside of the wheelhouse of what I might consider my style or my image or that kind of thing. So that's like a huge thing that I learned in terms of using reference and using it correctly is that like you can't always only be looking at the same places for that inspiration because then maybe you might fall into that trap of like, oh, well, it's obvious every time this guy draws or paints or whatever that it came from blah, blah, blah artist or something like that, right? Because I do think that happens a lot. They're almost um, like if I looked through Instagram right now, I could probably start making like categories of styles or of looks of certain types of ways that people draw, which is what art does, right? Like when you talk about like art movements and things like that, it is just a series of artists that all kind of find the same sort of shape, language, and media and style and stuff like that, right? So if you're trying to kind of make something your own, then you want to reference so many different ones of those things that no one will ever be able to trace them back to just one thing. But seeing a little bit of influence of something in your style is great, right? It's like, oh yeah, because that's how people connect to your art too. Like, oh, this looks like artist blah 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 that I already knew I loved. So now I can put this guy also in my head as an artist that I love, and that's a kind of a plus I think, is like making your art look a little bit like other people's art isn't the worst, right? Familiarity is kind of a good thing. Like if you're too obscure and too different, it can harm you sometimes in terms of the trying to be an artist out there who's like sharing and getting people to be interested in your work, right? You gotta like the reason why people do things within the same wheelhouse as other people, like you're going to start a podcast, you're going to want to look at other people's podcasts and maybe think about their formatting and things like that. So that when people find you, you're not so obscure that they're like, well, I don't get what's happening here because this is just so new. It's just too much of something that I've never experienced before. So there actually is something to that side of it, which is like giving people a familiar experience, but with a new spin, right? That's like I think that's the key to making a really beautiful piece of art that is like universal and timeless, is finding things done a little bit already by other artists and then finding a way to put what would be your sort of spin on that thing. I think that's the biggest part of like why I wanted to share this thing today as the topic for this one, is that it's just that idea of like trying to be so unique with your stuff. It can sometimes just be like, it can do the opposite, right? Because like it's great, and honestly, personally, I do love to find things that are like really cool and unique and like, whoa, this is great, no one's doing this and that kind of stuff. But sometimes it throws you off because you're like, well, this is just so, it's so unique, it's like in the wrong direction. It's like, well, I just don't get this. Like, I don't really know what this artist was trying to like show me or tell me with this kind of thing, right? It's like this thing that some artists do to themselves where um, there's a difference between wrong and style, I think, right? Like, it's like, oh, that looks a little off. And you're like, well, that's just my style. And it's like, there's a difference when you choose to stylize a way that an eye is drawn and a way that a face is drawn, and versus like just misproportionating the thing and making bad proportions and stuff like that, right? There's like, well, that's just wrong. That just makes for bad art, and there's no real excuse to that. Like, it's not just like, oh, well, that's just what he does because as an artist he makes his eyes too big. Well, that's okay, because when you're drawing from reference and when you're learning proportion, you know that eyes are one eye apart. So even if you make big eyes, you make them one eye apart in their shape and in their form, and you still actually get a very proportionate looking eye. And that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, is like understanding what you're looking at with your reference. Like, you're using your reference to help you build sort of shapes that are familiar, to build parts of the body, hands, right? Like, it's like when I found this Bowser, he was not in this position exactly. He had his hands kind of underneath like fists, but I wanted this like open palm hand thing going on. So I actually took a picture of my own hands from this angle and I mixed it together with this thing I was already drawing. And I was able to sort of basically build this in a new position that I couldn't find on the internet, or that wasn't already just sort of in my head, right? And that's like a huge thing for as an artist too, is like, okay, you have this thing in your head, but there's a big disconnect. And I kind of talked about in my last Live Ink episode about like, it's easy to get an idea and it's hard to follow through. Like, it's easy to understand a concept, but sometimes it's hard to find out how to follow through and show the concept. And I think that's where reference comes in. It's like, okay, I know I want this image of Bowser standing over Mario, and sort of all of these weapons and things that Mario has to deal with on a daily basis are like flying at him from different angles. But how do I show that, right? So I have to like start building a visual in my head of a piranha plant, and of a bullet bill, and of Chomp, and all these different sort of Mario villain, I guess villains is a good word for it, right? Enemies that he has to deal with. Like, I would never have been able to just pull, like, I know piranha plant is one of these types of plants, right? Like these man-eating Venus flytrap plants, but like, what are the details about this one specifically, so that I'm pulling into that reference and I'm getting that familiarity? And I think that's that thing about like why fan art works too. It's like, it's familiarity. It's like, okay, here's this style that I love from an artist, and then here's this subject that's familiar. And then the more that your fans get familiar with that, the more that you can start to draw their stuff too. It's like a goal of mine when I'm at conventions on my table is that I have a certain percentage of my own, my robots and my things, my prints and my originals are stuff that are from me and from my vision. And right now I have my students knocking down my door because I'm actually doing this while I'm at school during my plan period. So I'm going to ignore the knock for as long as I possibly can until they walk away. Because this is my own time and I'm doing my thing. I am doing my doodles, right? Oh, now they're knocking the door to a beat. It's a pretty good rhythm. I wonder how long it'll take for them to give up. It's getting pretty fancy. I think they gave up. There it is. That was longer than I'd expect. So anyways, I was actually kind of in the wrap up anyways as I kind of ink this. What I'm trying to say here is you as a new, I think it's a new, let's pretend you're a new artist, right? Or even an old artist who's been drawing for a long time and you feel stuck. This might be why. You might be referencing the same thing consistently, not referencing anything at all, and that's why your structures feel like they're weak. So start looking around, start building a folder, start thinking about where your influences come from, and your drawings will get better. You will find something in those drawings specifically. And you'll start to like sort of find a form and find a style and find a way to put your own spin on it because you'll be consistently drawing certain shapes over and over again that will become familiar to you. All right. There's the spiel. Here's the ink. I think what I'm going to do now is I kind of want to keep rolling at this, keeping myself in the zone. But I don't want these videos to trail off like this at the end of every single one of these like this. So I'm just going to leave it at that, guys. Thanks for joining in. Thanks, Ace. He always jumps in and checks my stuff out. Anybody else? Most of you are going to watch this later. Keep staying tuned and keep coming in for the good stuff and hearing what I have to say about life as an artist and everything in between. All right? Till next time. Peace.